Hi everybody! In this video, I provide an overview of self-determination theory and answer the questions, what is self-determination theory? And what can teachers do to promote intrinsic motivation? The music model of motivation includes 5 categories of teaching strategies that can be used to motivate students. I describe these categories in some of my other videos and on my website. Self-determination theory has implications for a few of these categories, but especially empowerment, success, and caring, as I explain in this video. Self-determination theory is comprised of 6 mini-theories. 2 of these are cognitive evaluation theory and organismic integration theory. I'm going to start by discussing cognitive evaluation theory, and then I'll describe organismic integration theory. Cognitive evaluation theory states that we have a need to perceive that we are competent. That is, we have a need to perceive that we are good at something. It also states that we have a need to perceive that we have autonomy. That is, we have choices and control over our actions. Finally, we have a need to perceive that we have relatedness. In other words, we're connected to others through positive relationships. So these are called the 3 basic needs in cognitive evaluation theory: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Here are a few key points related to cognitive evaluation theory and these 3 psychological needs. To be psychologically healthy, we need to have all 3 of these needs met. 1 or 2 are not enough. And these 3 needs are universal. That is, they're needed by people in all cultures. These 3 needs seem to be human qualities. They're not specific to a particular culture. And finally, feelings of competence don't enhance intrinsic motivation unless accompanied by a sense of autonomy. Relatedness is also important for intrinsic motivation, at least as a backdrop. In other words, relatedness is needed in some aspect of the person's life for them to be interested in and enjoy things. So when people's needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness are met, they feel intrinsically motivated. But what do they mean exactly by intrinsic motivation? Well, intrinsic motivation is defined as engaging in a task for the rewards inherent in the task, such as interest and enjoyment. Extrinsic motivation is defined as engaging in a task for the rewards outside of the task, such as grades or toys. Some points to note about these definitions are that they both involve rewards. It's not inside the individual and outside of the individual. I mention this because some people think that intrinsic motivation means that it's inside the person, or that they're born with it. However, it means simply that someone enjoys what they are doing. Finally, you can be high on both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. You can think of it like this, with each type of motivation on a separate continuum, ranging from none to a lot. I'll give you a few examples to demonstrate this point. Ming is high on intrinsic motivation because she loves to swim. But she's also extrinsically motivated to swim because it helps her stay in shape and healthy. As another example, Devin is high on intrinsic motivation because he loves to play football in college. But he's also extrinsically motivated to play football in college because he received a scholarship that pays for his tuition. But being a student athlete is difficult. So he doesn't enjoy every aspect of being on the football team. Some days getting up early to work out is definitely not enjoyable. Jack is high on intrinsic motivation because he loves to play video games. He's low on extrinsic motivation because he doesn't get any rewards separate from playing the games. In fact, sometimes his parents tell him he needs to stop playing to do his homework. Josephina hates her job as an optometrist. She's low on intrinsic motivation. However, she needs a job to help to pay for her apartment and car payments. So she's motivated to go to work for the paycheck. Therefore, we can say that she's high on extrinsic motivation. Finally, Sam doesn't enjoy playing with army figures, so he's not intrinsically motivated to play with them. And he wouldn't be rewarded in any way if he did, so he's not extrinsically motivated either. Because he is neither intrinsically nor extrinsically motivated, he doesn't play with the army figures. You might be wondering, why is the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation important? Well, in educational contexts, intrinsic motivation is important because it can lead to increased learning. Further, extrinsic motivation can have negative effects on intrinsic motivation. I'll explain this point more later. For now, let's move on to organismic integration theory, which is another mini-theory of self-determination theory. This theory makes distinctions between amotivation, extrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation. Within these are 6 different types of regulations. These regulations vary in the amount of autonomy that a person has and the amount of internalization of the motivation. Internalization is how much a person has taken in a value. Simply, it's how much a person values the activity. For intrinsic regulation, the person is fully autonomous and really enjoys what they're doing. In this case, the person is intrinsically motivated. For amotivation, a person is said to have non-regulation because the motivation is not integrated at all. Between amotivation and intrinsic motivation, there's a continuum where the lower the number next to the box in this figure, the more autonomy the individual has, and the more internalized the motivation is. Let me give some examples of each of these regulations to help explain this more. In amotivation, the person doesn't take any action, or the person's just going through the motions because they don't value the activity, they don't feel competent, or they don't expect the outcome to be desirable. An example is a student who doesn't know why she's in college majoring in chemistry when she already has her own clothing business and the skills needed to run it, so college won't help her. So she drops out. She doesn't value chemistry, feel competent in it, and getting a chemistry degree won't really help her in her business. Given this, it's understandable that she would drop out. Moving along the continuum, the next regulation is external regulation, which is part of extrinsic motivation. Here the motivation is to satisfy an external demand. In this way, it's pure behaviorism, such as when B.F. Skinner gave animals food for acting in certain ways. An example might be a middle school student who does an assignment to avoid confrontation with his parents, or a student who takes pre-med courses to get into medical school because he wants to be a physician only to make a lot of money. Another type of extrinsic motivation is introjected regulation. Here someone starts to internalize by valuing the activity and taking in regulation, but doesn't accept it as their own. Instead, they do it to avoid guilt or anxiety, or to attain ego enhancements, which means that they do it for the sake of their pride. An example would be a student who selected chemical engineering as her major to prove to herself that she could do it, or a student who gets to class on time to avoid feeling like a bad person. The next regulation is identified regulation. Here the person values a goal, and the action is accepted or personally important. So it's more internalized because it's more highly valued than the prior regulations I described. An example might be a college student who takes an extra statistics course because she wants to better understand statistics and how it relates to her major. Or a high school student who willingly does extra work in math because he believes that it's important for getting into college. The most integrated form of extrinsic motivation is integrated regulation. Here the person is identified with the importance of the behavior, but also integrates those identifications with other aspects of the self. It's not intrinsic motivation where the person is so engrossed in the activity that they lose time. In fact, for identified regulation, they may not even be interested in the activity. An example would be a music student who takes an extra course in composing, even though it's not required, because it's consistent with her life goal of being an excellent performer and teacher. Finally, we have intrinsic regulation. Here the activity is enjoyable in itself, and the person is also interested in it, which is different from integrated regulation, where the person didn't have to be interested in it. Intrinsic regulation is really flow, which is peak intrinsic motivation, where the person is so engaged in the activity that they may lose track of time. I have another video on flow if you're interested in learning more about it. An example would be a person who plays video games for long periods of time because it's enjoyable. So to summarize, self-determination theory is comprised of 6 mini-theories, and 2 of them are shown here. The first is cognitive evaluation theory, which explains how our competence, autonomy, and relatedness needs lead to intrinsic motivation. The second mini-theory is organismic integration theory, which explains different types of regulations and how activities can come to be valued. I will discuss these theories more now as I answer the second question of this presentation. What can teachers do to promote intrinsic motivation? The answer to this is that teachers need to support students' three psychological needs: their need for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. If we consider the 5 categories of music model strategies that can be used to motivate students, we can see that strategies from 3 of these categories, empowerment, success, and caring, directly relate to meeting the students' needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which then lead to intrinsic motivation, that is, students' enjoyment and satisfaction. Supporting these 3 needs can lead to intrinsic motivation, but they can also facilitate the internalization of values. That is, they can move someone along the regulation continuum from an external regulation towards an integrated regulation. When teachers facilitate internalization, self-determination researchers call this being autonomy supportive. Autonomy supportive teachers meet students' need for autonomy, but they also do other things. For example, Reeve and Jang did a study and found the following autonomy supportive teacher behaviors were correlated with students' perceptions of autonomy: listening to students, allowing students to talk, acknowledging students' experiences and perspectives, giving time for independent work, and these things, which seem to me to be more related to supporting their competence, like acknowledging improvement, encouraging students' effort, offering hints when students get stuck, being responsive to students' comments and questions. As you can see, these autonomy supportive behaviors support students' needs for autonomy, but some of them also support students' needs for competence and even relatedness. They also found that the following controlling behaviors by teachers were negatively correlated with students' perceptions of autonomy: monopolizing the learning materials, making directives, using controlling words, such as should and have to, and using directed questions to control the flow of conversation. And these things, which seem to me to not allow students to use their competence, providing solutions to problems before the students had time to work independently, and telling students answers without giving them time to formulate answers. Another topic that's directly related to teaching implications for self-determination theory is using rewards in educational settings. The question is, should teachers give rewards to students for their performance? To answer this question, we need to understand how rewards affect intrinsic motivation. Self-determination researchers have studied this, and they found that if rewards are perceived as being controlling, then students can lose intrinsic motivation. This is consistent with what we would expect based on self-determination theory, because the rewards would reduce a student's perceived autonomy. An example would be a teacher who says, "You will get to choose a prize if you finish all of your math problems." If a student perceived this as being controlling, then they would be less intrinsically motivated. However, if rewards are perceived as informational, then students could experience intrinsic motivation because it would support their competence need. An example would be a teacher who gives praise after students do something well. So this leads to the question, should instructors ever use rewards? Well, instructors can use rewards as an incentive, as a last resort when nothing else works. In this case, the teacher should start the rewards small. Don't tell the students that you're going to give them a trip to Disney World if they finish their math homework. Tell them that they're going to get a sticker, or a little more free time on the iPad, if these are things that they like. The idea here is to follow the basic principles that behaviorists have documented over the years. I have another video on operant conditioning if you're interested in learning more about that topic. The reason an incentive is okay in this case is because getting students involved in the activity may lead to new or increased skills. This may increase their perceived competence and lead to some intrinsic motivation. Another reason is that the mere exposure to an activity may increase a person's liking for it, such as the saying, "Try it, you might like it." A second time where it may be appropriate for instructors to use rewards is when they're used as evaluation or feedback. In this case, receiving a reward may signal success at an activity, which meets their need for competence and leads to intrinsic motivation. That concludes my presentation of self-determination theory. If you want more information about motivation, please check out my website and book.
And if you found this video helpful, please leave a like and subscribe with post notifications on for more Motivating Others content. Here are the references that were cited in this video. Thanks for watching. Bye!